Hello and welcome to my latest video. In this video I'm going to be starting to paint Lady Annika from the Soulblight Gravelord's army for Games Workshop, and this is going to be painted to a high display level. For this particular video I'm just going to be focusing on the head. So you can see there I've already primed the whole model and built it, and I've left the head separate, so it just makes it a little bit easier because she has like a little mask that gets in the way slightly, so it just makes things a bit more simple to paint. Just to start with, I'm using Kislev flesh and it's watered down heavily. Most of the paints for this video are actually going to be very heavily watered down. So this is around about 2 parts water to 1 part paint. You can see quite clearly as I'm applying it to the model that it's very, very translucent. So as you apply it, it's kind of almost like a very heavy wash. It's just I'm kind of not overloading it. So the first impulse that you'll have when you find how poorly it covers is to really load up the brush and just slap it on there. But the problem is that I'm going to be doing so many layers of paint that if you have the paint too thick, you'll very quickly build up a kind of a nasty texture. So for this, it's going to take about 3 or 4 layers, I imagine, to get a good coverage. And even then, I don't go to that extreme. I don't go for a completely opaque finish. So I'm doing the light coming from the left slightly. You may have seen the photo on my social media where the forehead's a bit mottled. It looks mottled already on at the stage we're at, but that's not the look we're going for. You can see there that I showing you the paints. So along with the Kislev flesh, it's Dark Reaper. These are the main 2 colours. For shading and highlighting, and then I had a bit of or later on I'll be adding some Ushabti bone and some Flayed flesh, but until that stage it's not something to worry about too much. But mainly what you want to look at is on the wet palette in the top right hand side. That is where the Kislev flesh is. It looks a little bit more orangey there on the wet palette than it does on the model. Part of that is to do with the background. So the wet palette has a white paper, whereas the face has obviously a black prime background, so it does affect the colour a little bit, and also it's not a completely opaque finish. If you look directly to the left in the middle of the Kislev flesh, there is the Dark Reaper. So that's the pure Dark Reaper in the top middle section. Then all the way around the Kislev flesh, so it's just below the Dark Reaper there, we have Kislev flesh with a small amount of Dark Reaper. Then below that it's a little bit more Dark Reaper. You have to be a bit careful. They're not exact mixtures. So the problem is that because Kislev flesh is such a light colour, adding even a small amount of dark to it will make a dramatic difference to the colour. So for the very first one, the mix I said where it's just a small amount, it's a very, very small amount, and you can see it gives kind of like grubby dark colour. But then below that, I say around about 50-50, but it's probably still more Kislev flesh than Dark Reaper. And then in the middle right, it's mostly Dark Reaper with a small amount of Kislev flesh. You probably can't see that much difference between the two, between like pure Dark Reaper and with the small amount added. But it makes more of a difference when it actually touches the model. Then the other colours, so on the bottom right, that's Ushabti bone. Then in the top left, that's Flayed flesh. And then I've also got as standard black and white on the wet palette. But we don't need to worry too much about those at the minute. But all of the paints on there, they're all very heavily watered down. In terms of for normal painting, normally, especially if you're doing tabletop, you wouldn't want your paints watered down this much. It just takes too long to get any coverage. And it's a lot harder to do very clean hard marks like this. But having the extra water on there, it's almost like working in glaze layers. Just very, very thick glazes, because usually a glaze would be like at least 4 or 5 parts water, I'd say, whereas in this case it's only 2 parts water. It just means that the paint is much more translucent, and you'll see that with how it runs on the models I apply it. So I'm only putting small amounts of paint onto the model, and you'll also have the situation where as you apply it, it looks like you've covered an area, then as it dries it becomes more translucent again. When I shaded in the eyes, I used pure Dark Reaper. And then I've just kind of like blocked in some of the other shadows. So I'm going to be jumping between different mixes between the two colours. And sometimes I won't even wash off the paintbrush. So it gives me even more options for the amount of variations there are, between how much Kislev flesh is in there and how much Dark Reaper. All of the differences that you'll notice are going to be very subtle. So I'm not going to tell you exactly which variation I'm using all the time, because it just becomes too complex, because sometimes you'll see that I've picked up a paint but I haven't washed off the paintbrush, and it'll get a bit confusing really, especially for me watching it as well. It's just more of a case of you're looking at the model, you work out your light source, so as I said, in this case the top left, and then you keep applying very, very small sort of micro alterations to it as you go along. So you can see here now I've actually started using the Ushabti bone quite early. Now, this is just to kind of block in the highlight positions almost. And it sounds weird to say blocking in at this stage, because if you see the marks I'm making, they're very soft. I'm not making kind of hard marks, but even then you have to, so you can see on the forehead there, sort of the pigment bunches up. You have to be very, very careful with the lighter colours. So the Ushabti bone and the Flayed one flesh, there's a lot of white pigment in these colours, and even though they're quite watered down, you still have a high chance of getting kind of a chalky look at the end just by working with them. You'll much more clearly get these little clumps of paint. Now it's not going to be a very obvious texture on the model, but just the way that the pigment particles will clump together in small sections on the model, especially when you want this very smooth finish, it just kind of becomes more obvious as you go along. However, so one of the reasons of using Dark Reaper is really nice, very small pigment particles. And so all the other mixtures that I've got any Dark Reaper on, they will actually blend in much more easily. So, part of the reason for using that is that reason. It just makes the blending process much simpler. And an interesting alternative way that you could paint this is rather than highlighting up like I am, you could almost paint it in reverse and just start shading it down. And so that will give you the benefit of having or making the transitions much smoother, more easily. But the problem is when you start putting dark colours over a very light colour, they stain them super duper quickly, and you can very quickly run into issues of having to fix mistakes that stand out really strongly. So if you just got some pure Dark Reaper, you've watered it down, and then you touch one of the bright parts on it. You're going to see this actually later on when I do the stippling on the forehead. It'll still make a strong mark, just not so strong that you get a hard edge to it, but it's high contrast. So just even a very delicate mark on it. If you want to then fix that, then you have to go over it again with all the light colours and layer it up, and that again risks more layers of paint, so more chance to get the sort of chalky finish. Nice little highlight that I'm doing there. You saw I was painting towards the on the bridge of the nose up towards the forehead section. It's a nice little area to highlight. A lot of people paint that as a recess, as a shadow, but actually if you paint up towards there, it kind of like draws the light focus more towards the centre of the face, and it kind of matches in nicely along with you see the highlight underneath the eye socket. Just to talk about the shadow around the eyes a little bit more, because it is a bit confusing. So she has very sunken eyes, and as I mentioned, I used the Dark Reaper to paint in all of that sunken area. So if like you gouged out her eyes and like the fleshy area around it, it'll make the same size socket. You can basically see her skull socket at this stage. And so the whole of that area I've just blocked in with the Dark Reaper. Now Dark Reaper has pretty poor coverage, so what you do have the option if you wanted to paint it in black, but I find that it's a bit too stark, whereas the Dark Reaper, just a little bit softer, so it kind of transitions in. And because I'm using that for the shadows on the rest of the face as well, it it just works a little bit better. But she very obviously has like very strong eyelids on the both above and below her eyes. Those will be picked out, but not until much later. I want to leave the big socket cavity really dark. This will help me in sorting out the contrast, the light and dark differences on the skin compared to this dark area, because I want to keep that dark sunken look to the sockets. Now, I mean, to an extent, the sculpt will help that anyway. The eye sockets areas are really sunken, but if you wanted, you could paint those quite bright and not leave the recesses dark, and that would have the effect of making it look much less sunken, especially in photographs. Sometimes you have to accept that when you see pictures online, they're not always the same as when you see them in flesh, because a lot of painters, they like to put their own kind of details on faces or other parts of of the model, regardless. And sometimes models just don't have details sculpted on them; they leave them a bit more smooth. So you can paint these sort of more extreme parts on a model with paint, but the problem is then when you see them in the flesh, sometimes you can see sculpting that is painted differently than the way it's sculpted. Whereas when you take a photograph of something, that kind of gets hidden a little bit. But it's not a major issue. It just depends on how you tilt the model and how the light catches it. So sometimes you'll be able to see details that otherwise you wouldn't. But in this case, I'm very closely going with the sculpting on the face. So mainly because it's such a small piece. And just to talk about that for a moment, this is a very small and very highly detailed head. I'm saying very a lot. But the details on it are really, really nicely sculpted. So the shapes and things, that it just makes it a lot easier to pick out these things for sort of a high contrast, nice with the light hitting it for a dramatic sort of face, to paint it. One of the pitfalls with these kind of sculpted faces, though, where they have these extreme details, is that people will very often paint them almost like edge highlighting. Now, there aren't really edges, but there are very strong definition parts on it. So, especially the cheekbones and the jawline, things like that. And she has creases on her cheeks going down to her lips, and also obviously the eyelids, above and below the eye. They're all very hard details, and so the impulse is to kind of pick those out as very hard edges, and that will give a very strong high contrast look to the face, but it's not really natural. If you look at someone's face, they don't have these highlighted hard edges, so it looks a little bit weird. Whereas with this, what I'm trying to do is to create sort of softer light volumes while still having the the visible shape, the really nice sculpted shape on there. Part of the light volume process that I'm doing is highly dependent on the very thin paints. This isn't something that you can do quickly regardless. It's not suitable for tabletop painting. I think this one probably took me an hour and a half to 2 hours, something like that. And it's purely because of the number of layers and the thinness of the paint that you're working with. Also because the paint is so thin, it's not so durable, because basically you're taking away a lot of the paint's properties by adding so much water to it. And you're just kind of like pushing pigment around. So I mean, it is like there's enough of the other parts of the paint in there that it will kind of still stick, but just don't rub it with your thumb. It is more delicate. So as I said, this is not for gaming. This is purely display kind of stuff. I mean, I might still use it for gaming. I'm going to put her on a normal base and things like that, and she'll go in my army, but I won't be touching the actual model. I'll only be touching the base for any kind of movement. If you look at the light placement on it, So I already mentioned that the light's coming from the left-hand side. My standard usual preference for painting these kind of videos, because it just makes it easier for you to see what I'm doing, because the camera's always on my left-hand side. But it does allow a slightly more dramatic look, so I can get these highlights on the left-hand side and keep the right-hand side slightly more shadowed, or picking out some of the details still on the right-hand side. And this will then allow the highlights on the left-hand side to look higher contrast. It just gives that slightly more dramatic look to it. And part of that, again, with the lovely sculpting on this, is so you can see along the cheekbone, there's some very subtle raised edges on the forehead and at the side, where they've got the sort of like the temples and things, and very soft details on the brow as well. I'm just really excited by this head sculpt, actually. I can't sing its praises enough. Apart from the fact that it is very small, it will be quite interesting to paint this as a larger piece, just because the size would allow you a bit more scope to paint in some of the more subtle details. One of the problems is with this scale of painting is it's quite hard to get those subtleties in there. They just become lost. So you can kind of paint them so they're visible for social media posts, but those are zoomed in. When you see the model in your hand, if you spend too much time on subtleties, they're almost invisible when you're looking at them. So it becomes almost pointless at that stage. Whereas having something that's a bit larger painted, you can show off these nice subtleties, and people can see them. I haven't talked too much about what I'm actually doing with the brush at this stage, so probably should, but I think you can see anyway. I've already mentioned it really, but the paint is very watered down. I hope you can see that when I touch the brush into the wet palette. Now, normally with a glaze, I would rub off the brush on some kitchen towel, whatever you use to take the paint off your brush is fine, but just so there's not too much on there. I'm not doing that in this case because I don't really need to. I'm only adding such a small amount. So you see there when the paint when the brush touches the paint, it's just dipping the very tip of the brush in there. Because it's so wet, it will soak in there anyway. And if you actually overload the brush, what you'll find is that the tip sort of splays out because it's so watery. I do rub it on my thumb just very quickly, just so that I take off any excess paint, so it doesn't blob too much. Allows me a bit of control. You can just see there, I think, on the screen, it very, very quickly just touching my thumb there. But normally what I end up with after I've been painting normally is I get kind of like a thick layer of paint on my thumb from the build-up or the layers of paint. But in this case, because it's such thin paint that I'm using, what I end up with is just like a very slight tint to my skin, so it's very easy to tell quite quickly if the consistency of the paint that you're using is too thick, because you will be building up layers quite rapidly, and that texture that I was talking about earlier will become very, very visible, just because we're talking like, I don't know, 20-30 layers of paint, possibly more in some areas. So now I'm going to be painting in the eyes. It was a little bit tricky to show this because they are sunken. They do sort of hide under her brow a little bit, and also I was struggling a bit to see them. Not because they're not a good size. They're a pretty good size, but considering it's a very small head. But because I used the Dark Reaper, so Games Workshop paint, it has a slightly satin finish. I've zoomed in here as much as I can. The problem is it's I can only zoom in so much and just start looking like Lego bricks. But the Dark Reaper has a slightly satin finish when you've painted with it. And what I found was that as the light was hitting the area, it was sort of like creating a bit of a shine on there, and I couldn't see the detail. So that was why I was rotating the model around a bit there. What I found was, and just by the way, I'm using Yriel yellow here for painting in the eyes, so it's not the brightest yellow, but it is a colour I quite like, and I didn't want, and this is painting the whites of the eyes basically yellow. I didn't want that to be too overpowering. But yeah, what I found was like if I just bit the bullet and blocked in the eye, I could then go back and tidy it up afterwards. And that was another benefit of using the Dark Reaper as just a flat colour around there without worrying too much about painting the eyelids at any point. So now I'm painting in the eye itself, and just black paint. So I'm using model colour black paint from Vallejo. I just prefer that a bit better. I find that if I water that down, now this isn't 2 parts water to 1 part paint, by the way. This is more like 1.5 parts water to 1 part paint, because I want to get the solid black colour rather than the translucency of the rest of the paints. Same goes for the Yriel yellow. Actually, don't water that down quite as much, because what you'll find is it'll run into the crevices and not really stick to the raised areas so much. So you can see there, I just painted in a little bit of an eyelid there. Now that I've done the eye, well, I say I've done the eyes, so I do put some white reflection dots on the eyes. I didn't record it in video because every time that I try and do it on video, I end up getting it slightly wrong and then having to redo it, and it just becomes a bit awkward. So, I mean, I think it's pretty obvious what you have to do. You take a dot of white paint and you put it on the black part of the eye. I might have another go on another head at some point, trying recording it for painting in the white dot, but as I said, usually what happens is I don't get it quite right because I'm so conscious of the fact that I'm recording it that I make a little mistake for putting the white dot on. So at this stage now I'm just going to paint in the teeth very quickly, just using Ushabti bone. I'm picking them out. Her lower teeth on the lower jaw, they are I think they're just sculpted as like one line. So originally what you're going to see here, I'm just going to paint it as a line straight in, or rather, well, at the minute you can see me painting in the lips. I'm using Mephiston red here, and I'm only painting the lower lip. It does look like there's a load of blood coming out of her mouth at this stage. It's because the highlight's not on yet. You'll see in a moment how I fix that. But the teeth are behind that, and they're just left black at the moment. Then I'll go back with the Ushabti bone and paint out the line. But what I do later on, because I wasn't happy with it, is I got some black paint and just put some little dots on there so that you can see separations of the teeth. I think you'll see here. There you go. So here you can see painting in the lower teeth. Now, this is purely preference. I think at this scale you wouldn't be able to see individual teeth, but it just looked a bit weird to me. So I put the black dots on. However, and I think it looks better with the black dots, but if you then scaled that up to a larger size, it would mean that she would have like massive gaps in between her teeth. So it's purely your preference as to how you do it. I think it's fine to leave it like this, but again, I just wanted to separate out the teeth. You see there, I put a bit of shine on the lip. That was just some Ushabti bone. I didn't wash off the brush, so there was still Mephiston red on the brush. But when I dipped it in the Ushabti bone, what you'll also find is when you rub it on your thumb, it just makes it a bit as well, so you get kind of a pinky colour. Then when you apply that, you can then judge afterwards if you want to take the highlight a little bit higher or not. So here I'm using P3 Morrow White. I always talk about this like it's just my preferred white. I bought a few pots of it anyway, so I don't need to use any other ones. I just find it flows a little bit more nicely. But you should be able to use any white if you want, really. Vallejo or Games Workshop, they will all do the job. I just find that the P3 Morrow White does it better for me. But the points that I'm doing, so again, at the very bottom of the cheek under the eyes, you can see the high contrast there. So the eyes actually become more of a focal point because of how dark set that whole eye socket area is, and then it's got the really strong white highlight just underneath. You can see here as well, I'm just picking out the two kind of vampire teeth, the incisors there, with the white as well. So a slightly more zoomed out shot, and back in again, so you can kind of like. So what I'm trying to do is take into account that it's a small model. So I don't know, either 28 or 32 millimeter, whatever it is, but it is a very small model, and it's okay to really focus on the details and the subtleties and things, as I mentioned earlier, but you still need these small models to look good from a distance. So that's why you need the high contrast. Sometimes people paint really beautiful, subtle things that they look great on photos, but then if you see them in the flesh, because there's so much subtlety and not really high contrast, especially if you do it for a golden demon or something like that, there's a chance they might even miss your model because it won't stand out from the crowd of the other models, just because you don't have that high contrast. So it's always something to bear in mind, especially if you're doing a golden demon competition. You want your model to stand out from the others because they have to pick it out before they can look at it closely. If your model doesn't stand out enough to be picked out, then no one's going to see those subtleties anyway. So now I'm working on the kind of the liver spots, the speckling on the forehead. So I'm using the 50-50 mix. It leaves quite a dark mark on the forehead, but you have to be a little bit careful. You can see as I'm applying it, I've made the dots larger near the hairline. Then as I go further down, they're getting smaller and smaller. What you can do as well is, so you start off when you paint them, the first dots, always keep these closer to the hairline because they will naturally be a little bit bigger, just because of the paint dot as you apply it. And then as there's less paint on the brush, and remember you're already using a tiny amount of paint on the brush anyway, and it will stay fairly fluid because it's so watered down, so you shouldn't have to worry about that too much. But as you get further down the forehead, because of the lesser amount of paint, you'll be able to do a smaller dot. But even with that in mind, still try and make the dots smaller. It just looks better. You will notice as well, I keep moving the head around, so I'm changing the direction. Part of that is because the dots that you leave with your paintbrush, they're roughly round, but not really. So if you just do them holding the head in one position, where you do all these dots, they're all going to look like a pattern with dot, sort of like an odd shaped circle, like maybe an oblong, or have a slight tail on it or whatever. It's very subtle, but you'll be able to pick out the pattern, the shape, because it's all been done in the same direction. So if you keep rotating it around, it'll look more natural because all the shapes will look more random. Also, if you find that the dots are getting too hard, or they stand out too much, so say you've gone straight for pure Dark Reaper, and you've oh no, I've made a mistake, the dots are too dark, just take some of the other colour on there. So you probably take the Kislev flesh, again watered down. You can paint over the dots that you've got. I am going to be glazing over it anyway to soften it down, because these need to be really, really subtle. Now, the shot's slightly out of focus. I think it's because it's so zoomed in. But you can sort of, they're too obvious at this stage when I look at the model in my hand. I want these to be, dialed back a little bit. So I will go back with the Kislev flesh, mix them on the brush. I probably won't wash off the brush in between, but just to go over some of the larger dots especially, and break them up a bit. It is a case of going backwards and forwards, just so you get this kind of like mottling. And you can also kind of build up the pattern as well. So you can see here I'm doing lots and lots of dots. And I've already mentioned about the dots being smaller the further down the forehead you go. But once you've done that, you can still go back to the top near the hairline and do more dots and sort of put them closer together. And then there'll be a variation of large and small dots as well. So you can see there, I actually I went in straight off without putting dots up near the hairline, but the sort of marks that I was making. I was trying to be as delicate as I could be while applying them, but also I'm just kind of gently picking out some of the sculpting on the shape of the head, on the brows, so that there's a darker line separating just above the nose, the two halves of the head. So here you can see I'm going to glaze over it as well. I think you can just about see what I was talking about with the dots on the forehead, how strong they look at this stage. And don't forget, you put quite a lot of them on there as well, so it will just make the forehead look darker. And I didn't want it to be too dark. You know, it's quite a prominent part on the model. She's got a very big forehead, and the head is sort of like the most important part on this model. So it's, you know, kind of important that you keep that lightness there. So you can see there, like, I didn't show you all the glazes. It's just the same thing going over and over, basically. Probably about 10 glazes, or maybe more. You know, judge it again by how you apply it, because everyone's mixes are going to be slightly different. Just make sure when you're glazing that you don't go over an area that's already wet. You need it to be dry before you do the next layer. So it might be worth having a hairdryer or something on hand just to speed up the process, because it's a small area. You're only doing a very thin layer. It should dry quick anyway, but you know, it can be boring or irritating, because you're not, like, if you were batch painting, you could move on to other areas, but because we're just focusing on the head, you don't have that option. You're just waiting for paint to dry. So obviously we're onto the hair now. I'm doing a nice little green transition on there. I'm using Moot green, and that's pretty much it. So it's Moot green mixed with black on the top layer. So it's around about 50-50 on the top left hand side. Then as we go further along to the right, there's more and more black added until it's just pure black on the top right. Middle left, that's pure Moot green. Then bottom left, that's Moot green with a small amount of white. That's all we're going to be using for the green part of the hair, so we'll just focus on that for the time being. The top left hand colour, the roughly 50-50 mix, what you're going to find is that it looks fairly green when you first apply it. It gets darker as it dries. Don't be tempted to just pick out the large strands of hair when you paint it. It's much quicker and easier to block in the whole area, because also what you'll find is, as you start highlighting up, if you've only picked out the highlight strands, you're going to get a lot of black in there at the top, and it's not going to really look green, especially as you go over the highlights, because when you go to the Moot green mixed with the white, you're desaturating the green a bit, so it won't actually look very green. There's not going to be that much green on the hair all over, because you've missed out the recesses. As you add the highlights, you will separate out the strands later on, but for these early areas, really get the paint into the whole kind of thing. Moot green also does not have great coverage, so when I said the 50-50 mix, I might be slightly off. Test it again yourself. It might be a case of you only need a little bit of black mixed into it. I probably could have done with more transitions between the top left mix and the pure Moot green below it. Having said that, the Moot green, as I mentioned, got terrible coverage, so the translucency of the paint will kind of do some of that transition for you anyway as you build up the layers. But it's when you get to the Moot green, this is where you start painting in some extra hair strands as well. So usually when they're sculpting the hair, what happens is it's just big blocks of hair. They're not going to pick out individual strands, and really neither can you for painting at this scale. It's just too small. But you can make it look more detailed, more refined, by painting in lots of extra sort of lines on these blocks. And that's what you're going to see. It's pretty straightforward. If you do dragging motions, so pulling the brush towards you, you should end up with a neater, straighter line. Follow the shapes and the curves of the hair. You can't really go too wrong. Again, don't use too much paint on the brush. You can, so as I mentioned, you can build up the layers, especially in these top sections that look like horns. So you can have the hair almost kind of twisting round. So the sculpt already kind of suggests that the hair twists around, but you can paint in more, and you just have to follow that shape as it goes round. Also, don't paint the green all the way down to the scalp or the forehead area. We're leaving that black, and you'll see why in a moment. But so the final thing here is just picking out some of the highlights. So this is again the Moot green mixed with a small amount of white. Well, I say it's close to 50-50. Just be a little bit careful when you first apply it. Test it, see if it's too light or not. It's not a big issue, but you know, you might want to put in some extra highlight steps as well. Really, but for this, so this isn't like the previous Moot green. Moot green is the main green color on it. With the highlight, you're just picking out the curves and things, how the light would sort of shine off there, and just pushing the contrast a little bit again. The more of this you add, the less green it's going to look. So you know, keep it small and simple. Just pick out a few areas. You can add in a little bit of detail as well because of the high contrast. These brush marks will stand out quite a lot the further down you go because it's getting darker and darker towards the roots of the hair. But as I said, you know, be very careful with this. It's high contrast, so if you make a big mark on this, it will stand out really clearly. Really, at this stage, when I was looking at it, I'm already thinking, you know, I don't need any more extra highlights put on. I have touched some white just to make these little bits shine here, but you know, keep that area very small and only keep it on top of the mix of the Moot green and the white. Don't add it to anywhere that's darker than that. So now you're going to see why we left the roots black. If you want, you can leave them black. It'll just look like she's dyed her hair green. I'm painting in these lines at the bottom. One, because I don't like leaving areas just plain black. I find it looks unfinished. It's going to add detail, but it will also... Well, you'll see as it progresses, but it kind of sort of frames the face a little bit better because you will still have the dark line in between the hair and the face anyway. And this will just... It basically looks like she's not dyed her hair for a while and now her roots are showing and she's got grey hair. I just kind of like that idea. It looks sort of interesting. So the colours I'm using are Basalt Grey and Dark Sea Grey. There's also some pale grey blue and white there. So middle right, that's the Basalt Grey. Directly in the middle, that's the Dark Sea Grey. Bottom right, pale grey blue. And then obviously white. I don't take the highlights up to white. I was considering it, but it would have been too strong. Especially because I don't want it to overpower the green. You've got to keep these subtle. The process is exactly the same as for painting the green. You're mainly working with the Basalt Grey. Try and carry on some of the lines that you've painted in. You kind of don't want to touch the green if you can help it, so you can have like a slight transition area where it is almost still left dark black, because the Basalt Grey is a little bit lighter than the darkest green mix, so it sort of looks a little bit weird if you touch the green with it. But again, like, you can't go too wrong really. The main thing actually of this is because of the highlights at the bottom here, and you see I'm painting more down to the scalp section, just be careful not to touch the face. Obviously the face took a long time, a lot of effort. You don't want to be getting, especially because these paints, for painting the hair, I have not thinned them down as much. So these are around about 50-50 paint to water. So these will definitely leave a strong mark if they touch the face. But you know, again, pretty straightforward. For these highlights on it, so this is more like representing the shine on these parts of the hair, using the Dark Sea Grey. It's just going over the lines that you've already painted and keeping it smaller. So and by that I mean, you know, the mark's smaller so that you can see some of the Basalt Grey either side. So, I mean, actually looking at it, it looks like I didn't go up to the pale grey blue. You don't even need it. So I probably won't put that in the video description. And here's the face kind of tacked onto the model. without the really bright painting light stuck over the top, so you can see the subtleties a little bit better. But anyway, that's the end of the video. I hope you enjoyed it. I'm going to be painting some more for Lady Annika the vampire. And she's going to have quite a detailed dress, and I'm also going to do something interesting with her Harlequin mask, so you have that to look forward to. But I hope you enjoyed it. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.